Bonnie Toland, who's going to speak to us about unconscious bias in design. So thank you, Bonnie. Oops, you're on mute.
Okay, there we go. I'm going to run through this pretty quickly because we don't have a lot of time. But unconscious design bias is what I'm calling it, is the basic concept that who we are and where we're from shapes how we design. We'll start with the senses. So we consider the senses universal, and on a biological level they are, but on an experiential level they're really not, because it depends so much on the environments that we were brought up in and how we filter and interpret sensory input. So for example, I'm from Alaska. It's very quiet where I grew up, and I have a hard time filtering auditory input, which people who grew up in a louder environment would maybe have an easier time with. There's an anthropologist called Edward T. Hall, who was older. Like, he was probably working in the 60s, but he would describe cultures as sensory rich and sensory poor. So for example, you're walking down the street in France and you smell bread breaking from the bakery, and you feel the cobblestones under your feet. This is a more sensory rich experience than, say, driving in the car. And you give another example of a Native Alaskan group far in the north of Alaska that could navigate during times when there was you couldn't distinguish the horizon because it was white sky and white earth, and they navigated by understanding the direction of the wind and the quality of the wind. These are sensory rich experiences. Edward T. Hall would describe Americans as kinesthetically deprived, meaning that our body awareness in space is deprived, basically. So to consider how might our sense experience inform how we design and how we experience space is something to consider. The same anthropologist did a study where he had students in Beijing and students at the University of Michigan look at an image similar to this for about 45 seconds and then describe it. The students at the University of Michigan were very good at describing the key characters. They had a lot of detail around the main objects of the image. The students in Beijing were better at describing the context around the characters with fewer details around the main characters. Another example is a study in Japan where they had, between Japanese and American students, they had people take selfies. American students took selfies of themselves prominently centered in the frame. Japanese students took pictures of themselves as a small portion of the frame and the environment around them as a huge part of their image. Another example of contextualization was a study between news coverage in China and the US over a shooting. In the US, the coverage was psychotic man shoots boss. In China, the coverage was man who recently lost his wife to cancer and then lost his job shoots boss. The idea of contextualization, but also understanding that human beings are not fixed, that objects are not fixed, that they are acted upon by their environments, which is something that we here in the US don't tend to do very much. We like our objects and we like them fixed. I have a book for my daughter that has just random images on a page. There's no environment, there's no relationship between the images, and she loves it. She points at all the pictures and says the names of the objects. But it's really an example of how we tend to think more object focused and object oriented. It comes out in the language learning. English language speakers tend to learn more nouns early in life, whereas, say, for example, Japanese language learners tend to learn more verbs early in life. So we want to think about how this relates to space, and like in a European or a Western sort of European or US model, our homes are people move from space to space around activity. So I have a room where I sleep, I have a room where I eat, I have a room where I socialize, and the people are the ones who move by the activity. In a traditional Japanese home, it's the room itself that shifts for the activity. The people stay in the same place, which is sort of an interesting idea of fixed versus unfixed. And you think of like Grim Koolhaas and how he would bolt down chairs so that people couldn't move them at all. We like our objects and we like them fixed. Time. So what is late? I know you probably have all experienced being in places where time is perceived differently than where you're from or what you're used to. What's interesting is that we haven't been on clock time all that long. Before trains, each town would have their own clock tower and they weren't synced. So when they had to sync trains, that's when they introduced time zones and started syncing those clocks. But that transition to clock time was a relatively painful transition. A lot of propaganda during the Victorian era. It was punctuality was virtuous, tardiness was shameful and slovenly. It was a painful transition to move from what had been really sun time to clock time. And there are still a lot of examples of sun time in our literature and our history. When you think of they wrote at dawn, they always wrote at dawn because everyone could agree when dawn was. That was one of the few fixed times that people had. And you think about what we might have given up in that transition. Like I couldn't tell you what fruits are in season. I can't tell you the time based on the sun. We've sort of moved away from that. And I grew up in Alaska, and we have our days they vary a lot throughout the year. And as a student, as a child, I would in the winter end up going to school in the dark and coming home in the dark. And we have really high suicide rates among youth in Alaska. And it wouldn't be a far stretch to put those two and two together. And I'm so happy to say that there are 3 villages, Yupik villages, in western central Alaska that have won to change their school season because the schedule of the school, the calendar of the school conflicted with 2 important hunting seasons, and they were subsistence living. And I think about how many generations lived with this conflict where students would just not be in school because they needed to subsist, they needed to help their families hunt. And so it's such a huge win, but it's so late in the game. So when the missionaries went to Alaska and they started their schools, the teachers were frustrated because the students kept coming later and later, and the students were frustrated because the teachers kept starting earlier and earlier because the students were still on sun time, whereas the teachers were on clock time. And now we're synced down to our cell phones. Now we live our lives by the minute. And proxemics, maybe you've heard this term before, like how much space do you need? How much distance do you put between each other when you talk? And generally that distance is pretty consistent within a culture, but it's not so consistent across cultures. I was once, when I was living in the UAE, I was waiting in line at this tourist destination, and a group of tourists came from South Asia, and a lady behind me came and she stood next to me, touching me, like her body was glued against my body, and I stepped back kind of shocked, and she stepped back sort of shocked at, like, we both thought each other was crazy. And later I did a project outside of Delhi, and I had a chance to observe people using the space, and they had meeting rooms that were designed for maybe 8 people with 12, 15 people in them. More chairs were brought in, and if there weren't enough chairs, people were on the floor. But the idea of how much personal bubble you need, how much space a person needs, is not consistent globally, and that we can consider that when we're looking at how we design our spaces. Hospitality, privacy, home, and ritual. I spent some time in Morocco. I don't know if you've been in a Moroccan living room, but their sofas are built in all around the perimeter of the room. And these sofas they double as beds. So this is a room where you can sleep in, you can socialize in, and then there's usually a round table, and people eat in these rooms as well. And you can cram in a lot of people around the round table. So it's very flexible, very expandable, contractible. And it's again that idea that there's not one chair, one person, that these spaces can flex really easily. And then people eat often with a shared plate, a round plate, and you stay within your pie. And one of the things I loved about Italy was the food culture and the courses and the ritual. I mean, so many people will put out a tablecloth. Everyone really puts out a tablecloth to eat their dinner, and it's such a simple gesture, but it sort of sets the stage for this ritual that satisfies you. So it's not just the biology of eating, but you're satisfied through that ritual. And living in, and another thing, you wouldn't see someone eating a sandwich walking down the street because that's considered like breaking unspoken rules, or someone eating alone in a restaurant. It was like, poor thing, you know. Um, and then social visits and living in Palestine was interesting because they're sequential. You basically, you juice, nuts, fruit, and then later you would serve like sweets and chocolate. And at the end of your visit, when you finish your coffee, you would say daime, which means may you always have this to provide to your guests. And because hosting is such a huge part of society, that it is sort of the backbone of society, and it is an honor, and there's so much pride in it. And what's interesting too is you wouldn't necessarily have a tour of a home because that was breaking into that private space. And I loved Arab gatherings, and I miss them so much. You arrive and you greet every single person that's in the social group, and when you leave, you say goodbye to every single person in the social group. And I'll tell you, I never felt so included in all my life. When I was in the UAE, we were trying to work with an Iranian architecture firm that did mostly local work. And they didn't bring us into a meeting room. They took us into a mejlis. And a mejlis is like a formal living room. So you sit in lounge furniture with your little tables for your inevitable beverage or treat. And so you're drinking tea and you're eating your sweet or your chocolate, and you're discussing the daily events, and you're discussing each other's the achievements of the children, or etc., because you're building rapport and all of your and trust, and the success of your business relationship will depend on that rapport and that trust. So it's a very different way of doing business than, say, what we tend to do here. And our question is, so how are the spaces that we are creating supporting our rituals, supporting our gathering, how we gather and how we interact with each other? So I like to see how the macro impacts the micro. And generally, a lot of us are inheritors of a Roman tradition. I mean, Romans, all the cities, they really were strong grid followers. And we love grids. I mean, why not? They're organized, they're easy to navigate. So we tend to bring that into how we look at interior spaces. Interestingly, Japanese also had a grid system. And prior to the Allies occupying Japan after World War II, it was actually, they would name the intersections and not the streets. So really more of a dot system than a grid system. And the numbering system too was chronological rather than spatially sequential. So it would start with, this building was number 1 because it was built first. This one was 2 because it was built second. And they didn't have to necessarily be next to each other. And like when the French, so this upper left corner here is Paris, large boulevards, clear sight lines, tall monuments. When the French went into North Africa, which is like maybe Fez, I think is the one next to it, they saw chaos. They saw, well, they're like, well, we'll fix this. This is a mess. Let's put in. So they started putting in large boulevards, big monuments, and you have these French cities throughout North Africa. But they didn't understand the thought and the structure that was already in place. So for example, in the Medina, you have these very narrow little walkways, and usually the end house is the most affluent family, and they would usually take responsibility for organizing things like trash collection. And the streets, the ground floor would have no windows to protect people's privacy, so nobody would look into their homes as they're walking down the little street. And on the second floor, the windows would be staggered so that would respect people's privacy. So you look out your window, but you don't see immediately into the next house. So there's a lot of order and structure here, but the French couldn't see it because they had their structure and their order. And so we want to think about, how does our order and our structure impact how we design, and what are we imposing on others when we're designing beyond our own communities. So make the unconscious conscious. First step, self-awareness. Know where you're from, know who you are, know your own preferences. We're not going to get rid of our biases. They're part of us. That's how we grew up. But we can be aware of them so that we're not imposing them on others. And empathy. Try it on. Do something else. Do things outside of your comfort zone. broaden your circles of interaction, and you don't have to go halfway around the world to do it. Withhold judgment and listen and observe before you solve. So for example, someone might say, oh, I need my desk. And okay, you might solve it by giving them a desk, or it might be that they're saying, I don't feel secure in this company. I need to know that I have a place here that I belong and that I'm not expendable. And so if that's what's really being said, your solution might be different. So listen and listen between the lines and observe before you solve. Like the best projects I've ever been involved with have been projects where we've been able to observe how people are using the space and how they interact, because they respond and reflect people's identities and values so much more vibrantly than otherwise. And so we are a borderless firm, and we have a responsibility and an opportunity to lead in what can be truly global design. And that is I hope I was okay.